While I'm pouring some water, I shall introduce Richard Dawkins, who needs no introduction. You all know who he is. He's a fantastic evolutionary biologist. He's written many, many books. He was Oxford University's Professor of Public Understanding of Science from 1995 to 2008. And he's an outspoken critic of creationism, intelligent design, and even religion itself. We'll get onto that later. I thought to myself, when did I first become aware of Richard Dawkins? It's one of those really difficult questions because it's almost as long as I can remember, but I know when it was. It was at school when a biology teacher recommended that I read The Selfish Gene, and I was utterly blown away by it. And I was gripped by Richard's ability to communicate the complexity in biology. And after that, I graduated onto The Blind Watchmaker and followed the debate between Richard and Stephen Jay Gould, punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism. It was like a presidential race, and I'm still not sure who won. And then there was the extended phenotype, River Out of Eden, Climbing Mount Improbable, Unweaving the Rainbow, The Ancestor's Tale, and of course, The God Delusion. And that's not even all of the books. But in his most recent books, in An Appetite for Wonder and now in Brief Candle, Richard Dawkins has turned his interrogative gaze on himself. So what led to the evolution of this peculiar breed of evolutionary biologist? You open Richard's book and you find him in the hall of New College, Oxford, on his 70th birthday, being slightly surprised at being there, I think. And Richard, you say, I'm there as a subjective 25-year-old. And I read that and thought, really? Is that how you feel?
Well, that's a bit high. Maybe 18 would be nearer the mark.
But it's such a wonderful passage, so I would quite like you to read that opening.
What am I doing here in New College Hall, about to read my poem to 100 dinner guests? How did I get here, a subjective 25-year-old, objectively bewildered to find himself celebrating his 70th orbit of the sun? Looking around the long candle-lit table with its polished silver and sparkling wine glasses, reflecting flashes of wit and sparkling sentences, I indulge my mind in a series of quick-firing flashbacks. Back to childhood in colonial Africa amid big lazy butterflies. The peppery taste of nasturtium leaves stolen from the lost Lilongwe garden. The taste of mango, more than sweet, spiced by a whiff of turpentine and sulphur. Boarding school in the pine-scented Vumba Mountains of Zimbabwe, and then back home in England, beneath the heavenward spires of Salisbury and Oundle. Undergraduate days, damsel dreaming among Oxford's punts and spires, and the dawning of an interest in science, and the deep philosophical questions which only science can answer. Early forays into research and teaching at Oxford and Berkeley. The return to Oxford as an eager young lecturer. More research, mostly collaborating with my first wife, Marion, whom I can see at the table here in New College. And then my first book, The Selfish Gene. Those swift memories take me to the age of 35, halfway to today's landmark birthday. They milestone the years covered by my first book of memoirs, An Appetite for Wonder. Unlike An Appetite for Wonder, this second volume of my autobiography is not simply chronological. Not even a single flashback from my 70th birthday. Rather, it is a series of flashbacks divided into themes, punctuated by digression and anecdote. Since we're dispensing with rigid chronology, the order of themes is somewhat arbitrary. I said in the first volume that, insofar as anything was the making of me, Oxford was. So why not start with my return to those glowing limestone walls?
That's just wonderful. And if you haven't read Appetite for Wonder, then please do, because that fills in the gap. And then obviously you're going to read Brief Candle after that. So in Oxford, you, and remaining at the beginning of the book, which starts off in a vaguely chronological way, yes, before it explores themes, you describe in 1989 how a particular burden, a black spot, fell on you, and you became the warden.
No, sub-warden.
Sub-warden,
Yeah.
sorry.
The warden of New College is the head of the college, and
Right.
it's an honour to be the warden. You actually have to get elected, and you know, it's quite a thing. Sub-warden is not like that. Sub-warden is Buggins' turn. You just inexorably, the black spot travels down the order of seniority, and I could see it coming and dreading it. You have to attend all committees, you have to take the minutes, you have to make speeches at dinners, and you have to welcome new fellows and say goodbye to old fellows, and you have to make a speech at the Gordy, and that's the sort of alumni dinner. And fortunately, the good thing is it only lasts for 1 year.
But you enjoyed writing the minutes.
I enjoyed writing the minutes. I like slipping little jokes in for the amusement of those of my colleagues who bothered to read them, which wasn't necessarily all of them.
And you had to say grace as well.
Yes, that's part of the duty. Yeah.
Yes, I like the end of that paragraph there, which I think probably sums up how you feel about saying grace as well.
As sub-warden, I had to preside over dinner in hall and say grace before Benedictus Benedicat and after Benedicto Benedicata. One of my predecessors as sub-warden, the ancient historian Geoffrey de St. Croix, used to refuse to say grace on conscientious grounds. He described himself as an atheist politely militant. Equally conscientiously, however, he went out of his way to line somebody up to say it for him. Once when I was a dinner guest at King's, our sister college at Cambridge, whose chapel, incidentally, is one of the most beautiful buildings in England, the senior fellow presiding was the incomparable Sidney Brenner, one of the founding fathers of molecular genetics and winner of a well-deserved, they aren't always, Nobel Prize. Sidney gavelled everybody to stand, then solemnly intoned to his neighbour, "Dr. So-and-so, will you please say grace?" I, however, was of the school of thought of the great philosopher Sir Alfred Eyre, who, when sub-warden of New College, cheerfully said grace on the grounds that "I will not utter falsehoods, but I have no objection to making meaningless statements."
Brilliant. Now, we are here at the Royal Institution, and it's absolutely wonderful to be here in this lecture theatre. It is such a beautiful setting, although you were pretty much locked in the building, I think, for 2 weeks back in 1991.
More than 2 weeks. Most of a year. I did the Christmas lectures in 1991, so this place is hauntingly familiar to me. And not just the lecture theatre, but what used to be a sort of glory hole of rubbish back there, which was Bryson Gore, who was then the chief technician's storehouse of relics from previous lectures, which might one day come in handy. I think I spent the best part of a year actually here preparing the lectures.
So you were dreaming up all these interactive ways of demonstrating evolution.
As you know, one of the things about the Royal Institution lectures is you don't show slides, or not very many slides. You call children up to assist in demonstrations, like a conjurer. And they love it. I mean, they love to be called out to assist in demonstrations.
Yeah, they don't always love it, though, do they? So I'd like you to read another excerpt.
In Lecture 5, I was talking about a revealing difference between two ways in which the retinal image can move. If you shut one eye and gently poke the other eyeball through the lid with your finger, I asked the children to do this to themselves.
You have to do it.
The whole scene appears to move as if in an earthquake. But if you move your eyeballs using the dedicated muscles attached to them for that purpose, you don't see an earthquake, even though the retinal image has moved just as if you had poked your eyeball. The world seems to stay rock steady. You just look at a different part of it. One explanation offered by German scientists is that when the brain gives the order to swivel the eyeball in its socket, it sends a copy of the order to the part of the brain that perceives the image. This copy primes the brain to expect the image to move through the precise amount ordered. So the perceived world looks steady because there's no discrepancy between observed and expected. When you poke your eyeball, no copy is sent. So the world appears to move as if it really has moved, as in an earthquake, because now there is a discrepancy between observed and expected. I pretended I was going to demonstrate the effect with a key experiment. I would paralyze the eyeball-moving muscles with an injection. Then, when the brain sent an order to move the eyeball would stay still, but the copy of the instruction would still be issued. So the person would see an apparent earthquake even though the eyeball hadn't moved, the apparent movement being the discrepancy between expected and actual zero eye movement. Well, this being the Christmas lectures, the next thing to do was to call for a volunteer. I produced a huge veterinary hypodermic syringe, fit to sedate a rhinoceros, and asked who would like to take part in the experiment. Normally, the children at the Royal Institution lectures fall over themselves in their eagerness to assist in demonstrations. Surely nobody would volunteer in this case, and I was about to reassure everyone that it was only a joke, when one little girl of 7, probably the youngest in the audience, hesitantly raised her hand. It was my darling daughter, Juliet, sitting shyly by her mother. I still choke up a little at the memory of her uncomprehending loyalty and courage in the face of the monstrous hypodermic that I was brandishing. Is it irrelevant that she is now a promising young doctor?
Yes, incredible loyalty. Now, there are quite a few passages in your book where you talk about translation, sometimes literally, in fact, and sometimes it goes very well and sometimes it doesn't go quite so well. And obviously, your books have been translated into many different languages right across the world. So the next passage I'd like you to read us is one about, well, a successful translation, but then it moves on to talking about a less successful translation. And I think Michelangelo's Kevin makes an appearance at the end of that one.
Das egoistische Gehen appeared a little later. I soon received a letter from a reader in Germany who said that the translation was so good, it was as though author and translator were twin souls. I, of course, looked up the name of the translator, Carine de Souza Ferreira. And its surprisingly un-Germanic sound made it easy to remember. A little later, at his home university of Zurich, I met the distinguished primatologist Hans Kummer. At dinner, I started to tell him the anecdote about my German translator. I had got no further than twin souls without ever mentioning the name of the translator when he spontaneously interrupted me, pointing his finger at me in a pistol-shooting gesture as he asked the question, Carine de Souza Ferreira? After 2 such splendidly independent testimonials, when the time came for The Blind Watchmaker to be published in German, I put in a strong request for the same translator, and I'm delighted that my German twin soul with the Portuguese name graciously came out of retirement to render the book into Der blinde Ohrmacher. I haven't always been so lucky with my translations. One Spanish edition, I won't say of which book, was so bad that 3 separate Spanish speakers approached me to say it should be withdrawn. English idioms were translated word for word in the same way as he gave her a ring, telephone call, in an English novel is said to have been translated into the Danish equivalent of he gave her a ring for her finger. That Danish story may be an urban legend, but it is true that in my Spanish case, the phrase with a vengeance, meaning in a big way, was translated as con una venganza, which I'm assured means what it literally says and makes no sense of the idiom. That's just one example among many. It's one reason, again among many, why computer translation is so difficult. The translator needs not merely a lexicon of words, but a lookup table of idiomatic phrases like with a vengeance, even a table of cliches like at the end of the day, meaning when all's said and done, yet another cliche. Isn't language fascinating? I'm glad to say the Spanish publishers took full responsibility and commissioned a whole new translation, which is now published. The danger of relying on computers to perform human functions reminds me of a lovely story told me by my friend Felicity Bryan, reputed to be Oxford's only literary agent. One of her clients wrote a novel whose hero was called David. At the last moment, when the book was finally edited and ready to print, the author had second thoughts about her lead character. He was more of a Kevin, she decided, than a David. So she set her computer to do a global search, replacing David with Kevin throughout. This worked well until the action of the novel moved to a certain art gallery in Florence.
Absolutely brilliant. I mean, you talk about translation in your book, but you also talk about obviously getting messages across to an audience, sometimes scientific and sometimes much wider. And there's an interesting collection of passages in the book where you're discussing scientific writing and the way that we tie ourselves into straitjackets, and we force ourselves to follow this rule of introduction, methods, results, discussion, and we just carry on doing it even if it makes no sense.
Yes, this was brought home to me when I was editor of a scientific journal. It happened to be the journal Animal Behaviour, but the pattern there was the same as in almost all scientific journals: introduction, methods, results, discussion. And that works. It's a bit dull, but it sort of makes sense. Until you come to the sort of paper where there's, say, a series of perhaps 4 experiments, where each experiment leads off from the one before. So experiment 1, the result of that prompts the need for experiment 2, and the result of that stimulates experiment 3, which in turn leads you to do experiment 4. There's a narrative flow leading through these 4 experiments. But how did people actually write it when they were submitting such a paper to my journal? Instead of going through the experiments as a narrative flow, 1, 2, 3, 4, they did it like this: introduction, methods 1, methods 2, methods 3, methods 4. Results 1, results 2, results 3, results 4. Discussion. What an absolutely daft way to write a paper. You think it totally loses the element of storytelling. It totally loses the logical sequence that the 4 experiments do. And time and again, as editor, I tried to persuade authors to put a more of a narrative flow into their papers, but old habits die hard.
So that hasn't had a widespread ripple effect through scientific publishing?
Well, it may, no, I can't claim that.
It's the sort of structure that I think perhaps is there in PhD theses. That an argument is being built, and you do unpick it gradually.
A good one should be, yes.
Yeah. But we don't seem to do it in our scientific writing.
Well, some people do.
Going back to Lost in Translation, this is just a fantastic passage, Richard, which is from The Blind Watchmaker, and you're quoting Stephen Jay Gould, and there is this hidden joke in an index.
You're giving the game away.
I am, sorry, I'm sorry. I must let you read it.
No.
And how it infuriated the American publishers.
Yes. My second story about The Blind Watchmaker I tell for no better reason than that it's quite funny. First, a little background. Many evolution skeptics have been puzzled by an aspect of the perfection of animal camouflage. They reluctantly accept that bird eyes are sharp enough to put the finishing touches to a resemblance of intricate perfection, such as that of a stick insect to a stick, complete with buds and leaf scars. Or another example, there are caterpillars that resemble a bird dropping. But then the skeptic says, how can you accept selection for the final detailed perfection of mimicry of a stick or a bird dropping on the one hand, while also believing that the same kind of selection shaped the ancestors of those insects on their first tentative fumbling steps towards a resemblance? I quoted Stephen Jay Gould on the bird dropping mimic. Can there be any edge in looking 5% like a turd? I answered the question in a way slightly different from Gould's. The very same eyes are presented with prey under great variety of seeing conditions. Dim versus bright light, corner of the eye versus full frontal, far away versus close up. A minuscule resemblance to a bird dropping might be enough to save a caterpillar's life when seen from a distance or in twilight. but a strong resemblance would be necessary to save its life when seen close up and in strong daylight. And there is a continuous gradient from poor seeing conditions to good, which provides a smooth selection pressure for every degree of improvement in mimicry from crude to perfect. The same gradient argument works for all complex adaptations, eyes, wings, all the chestnuts of creationist literature, and is of immense importance for the whole theory of evolution. That's the background to the story. Now, Stephen Gould's name appears several times in The Blind Watchmaker, and therefore also in the index. The index to a book, with its military-style backwards formatting, is a fine place to conceal a joke. It will not be noticed by many, but those who see it will share with the compiler a smile of secret complicity. The official history of New College, Oxford, 1379 to 1979, edited by my late colleagues John Buxton and Penry Williams, has an index compiled by a third colleague, the medieval historian Eric Christensen, whose own memoirs of New College life will not be, and by all accounts should not be, published until after he and all his victims have died. Eric smuggled into the index of the college history some delightfully characteristic little jokes. Under fellows, for example, we find comforts of, drunkenness of, execution of, expulsions of, factions among, obscurity of, provenance of, and my favourite, Philistinism of. Turn to the pages indicated under Philistinism of, and you find no mention of the word itself, just accounts of 3 building projects, which obviously offended Eric's taste. 2 in the 19th century, and an especially egregious one in the 20th. Anyway, as I said, I put a little joke for Steve Gould's benefit in the index of The Blind Watchmaker. It duly appeared in the original British edition. However, when the American publishers saw it, they were aghast. They thought it in terrible taste, and they may just possibly, although I was too discreet to ask, have been conscious that Stephen Gould was one of their most bankable authors. Publication of the US edition was held up while the joke was expunged. Then, unintentionally, as a result of a simple oversight, the microfilm version containing the censored index was the one used in subsequent printings of Longman's British edition and Penguin's paperback. Michael Rogers, the editor, had intended that the joke should remain in the British edition. The fact that it didn't may, for all I know, confer on the first British printing a collector's value, along the lines of the unperforated stamps prized by some philatelists. Now, I've now put the 2 versions of the index, and the relevant part is Gould 5% I, 81, quoted in 41, 5% resemblance to turd, and the American one simply says, on dung mimicking insects.
Did Steve Gould say it?
I don't think he ever saw it, no.
There's another story about Lost in Translation where you were the victim, I think. And it only dawned on you very gradually that there had been some, not necessarily an error, but just a strange transformation of words.
Oh, right.
And this is titled in your book, The Taxicab Theory of Evolution. Right.
In An Appetite for Wonder, I recalled a visit to Oxford by a Japanese television crew. They turned up bristling with tripods, lights, umbrella reflectors and camera gear in a London taxi, and the director was keen to conduct the interview in the moving vehicle. This proved difficult, partly because the official interpreter's English was unintelligible to me. So interview perforce became impromptu monologue, while the unfortunate interpreter was banished to walk the streets for an hour. And partly because the bemused taxi driver from London didn't know Oxford. So I had to interrupt my discourse at frequent intervals to bark, turn left or turn right, over my shoulder. I'd been told to take the interview on the scenic route round Oxford. When we returned to New College, I was curious to know why it all had to be done in the taxi. So I asked the director and received the puzzled reply, are you not author of taxicab theory of evolution. It was my turn to be puzzled until I later worked out the probable origin of his phrase. In my writings, I've made frequent reference to the body as the survival machine or vehicle for the genes that ride inside it. My guess, although I never checked it, is that a Japanese translator of one of my writings must have rendered vehicle, with a little poetic license, as taxicab. Television being television, that would have been a sufficient reason for conducting the interview in a moving taxi.
I just can't believe they didn't ask you. It didn't occur to them to ask you about it before then. Well, in this book, there are all these wonderful anecdotes and details and a lot of science in there as well. So you talk about your own ideas evolving in the book and your forays into television and sort of adventures in writing, but also there are some really personal moments in there as well. So that's where I'd like to move on to. And if you were to come up with an idea of who you might invite to your dream dinner party, amongst those guests, of course, might be Richard, but maybe Stephen Fry and Douglas Adams as well. And there's a passage in the book where you're at a party with Stephen Fry and Douglas Adams, and he leaves in the middle of the party and never returns. So I'd like you to read this to explain to the audience what was more important and more interesting.
Dear, okay. This was 1992 when Douglas Adams reached his 40th birthday, and his party was memorable for a particular reason. It was there that he introduced me to the actress Lalla Ward, whom he had known from the days when Doctor Who was at its wittiest, because he was the script editor, and she and Tom Baker gave added value to the wit by their inventively ironic playing of the two leading roles. At the birthday party, Lalla was talking to Stephen Fry, when Douglas led me over and introduced us. Douglas and Stephen are both absurdly much taller than Lalla and me, so it was natural that we should find ourselves facing each other under a Gothic arch formed by Douglas and Stephen as they exchanged lofty witticisms high above us. Through the archway, I shyly offered to refill Lalla's glass, and when I returned, we rapidly reached agreement that the party was too noisy for conversation. I suppose by any faint chance it wouldn't just possibly be a good idea to go out for a quick meal and, of course, return later. We discreetly slipped away and found an Afghan restaurant off the Marylebone Road. That Lalla had read The Selfish Gene and watched my Christmas lectures was gratifying. That she had read The Extended Phenotype, and Darwin as well, was too good to be borne. I subsequently discovered that, in addition to Doctor Who's companion, she had played a beautiful Ophelia to Derek Jacobi's Hamlet in the BBC TV production, and was also a talented and versatile artist, published author, and book illustrator. As I said, too good to be born. We didn't return to the party. I mentioned to Lalla that I was about to embark on an American journey, having added the itinerary added to it a visit to John Brockman. She said she was about to set off on a holiday in Barbados with a girlfriend from the theatrical world. Impulsively, she asked if I would take her to America with me, although it would mean letting down her friend in Barbados. Equally impulsively, I agreed. Slight embarrassment then opened up. I was due to stay with Dan and Susan Dennett on first arriving in Boston, and later with the Brockmans in Connecticut. In both cases, one house guest was expected, not two. How could I broach the subject? Lalla and I fretted that our hosts would ask. It is, after all, a perfectly normal question to ask of a couple. How long have you two known each other? And we would have had to answer, a week. As it turned out, they didn't ask, and it was only years later that Lalla confessed to Dan the truth. Really, said Dan, with possibly mock innocence, I thought you'd known each other for years.
Do you think he really thought so?
No.
No. There's another really personal and entertaining passage that caught my eye, actually, because there's a little bit about vegetarianism in here.
Oh, yes.
And I used to be a completely strict vegetarian, and now I'm one of the vegetarians that I used to hate because I'm a vegetarian who eats fish. I think I might have to call myself a pescatarian. Because I used to meet vegetarians who'd say, "Oh, but I do eat fish," and I used to have to take them to task and explain to them that fish were clearly not vegetables, and they needed to go back to school, study biology again, and then come out the other end and tell me what they really were. Yes, but I started eating fish when I had my children, actually, because I was worried about omega-3, but never mind. That's not the issue. When I was a strict vegetarian, I was a strict vegetarian for ethical reasons, and when I was cycling home from Bristol University one day, I found a deer on the cycle path, which is next to the road, and the deer had not been there that morning, so I knew it was less than 9 hours killed. It was quite a big deer. It was an adult male roe deer, and I tried to get it on the back of my bicycle and gave up, cycled home, rang a friend. He got it in his boot, and we hung it up in his house. He was renovating his house at the time, and about a week later, his wife rang me up and said, "Will you come and do something about this deer that you hung up in my what is to be my downstairs toilet?" And there ensued this very shallow grave scenario where I borrowed some items of equipment from Bristol Vet School, and we gutted the deer into a wheelbarrow in order to avoid messing up the floor, as you do, and then chopped it up into various pieces and ate it. And I did this. I was an anatomist, so I'm not squeamish about flesh at all. But as a vegetarian, it was a very odd thing to do, to eat this flesh. But it was ethically perfectly fine because it had been roadkill. Yeah. So my ethical objections were kind of put to one side. But it was very strange to go from just eating vegetables to eating the most gamey, meaty thing you can possibly imagine. So this leads me on to...
A moral philosopher might say, why don't we eat human roadkills? Well, okay. Here we go with this. This is about Miriam Rothschild, who was a distinguished entomologist, a fellow of the Royal Society, expert on fleas and various other things, a remarkable character, and this is about her. I didn't know Miriam well, but so remarkable a character demands a digression. She used to invite Lalla and me to her annual dragonfly party, so called because guests were encouraged to view the dragonfly conservation measures around her lake at her country house at Ashton, near Oundle, where I had earlier been at boarding school. Her garden was something to behold. There is a coffee table book, The New English Woman's Garden, in which each double-page spread is devoted to the garden of some high-born or well-connected lady. The pages glow with immaculate lawns shaded by immemorial cedars, tastefully understated flower beds, herbaceous borders, shady arbours, and ancient brooding yew alleys. All is as expected until you turn the page to the garden of the Honourable Miriam Rothschild. They could have left off the Honourable and replaced it with FRS, but that would have been out of the book's character. Her garden was stylishly her own. The plants were all such as the other ladies would have called weeds. They consisted entirely of wild English meadow flowers and unmown grasses. Waves of flower-decked long grass buffeted the walls of the house and crashed through the windows into the interior window boxes, which therefore looked like an indoor continuation of the garden. The large house itself was so smothered in creepers you almost needed a machete to find it, like a fairy tale castle in an enchanted forest. Under faded family photographs, including one of the bowler-hatted and full-bearded second Lord Rothschild driving through London in his coach pulled by 4 zebras, were the cases containing the celebrated Rothschild insect collections. The luncheons themselves were sumptuous buffets. At one of these annual dragonfly bashes, she beckoned me over to her table. "Come and sit by me, dear boy. But first, go and carve me a slice of venison. A very small slice, mind you. I'm a strict vegetarian." To be fair, the deer had not been killed for food, but had died of an accident. So you could say that her vegetarian principles were being upheld in the spirit, if not the flesh. Miriam owned a herd of rare Père David's deer brought back from China by her father with a view to conserving the species. They're extinct in the wild. One of these deer had unfortunately got itself entangled in a fence and died. Hence the venison on the ethical buffet table.
Now, you've also, as well as making a career out of science writing, you've also embarked on a television career as well. And you've done several television programmes where you apply the force of reason to various areas. And Enemies of Reason was a prime example of that. And I just, yeah, this is absolutely wonderful. This is how you tackle people who come up to you and say that they can hold two wires and that they're going to cross over and that they'll be able to tell if there's a glass of water there.
Yes,
and they're not doing it. The wires do it themselves.
Enemies of Reason contained a telling sequence on dowsing, coordinated by the London University psychologist Dr. Chris French. Professional and amateur water diviners converged from far and wide to show their prowess, confident in their ability, proved to their own satisfaction over years. Alas, they had never before been subjected to a double-blind trial. Inside a big tent, Chris French laid out a rectangular array of buckets. Some of the buckets contained water, some contained sand. In the preliminary trial, the lids were removed from the buckets, and the dowsers all had no difficulty. Their divining rods, hazel twigs, or pieces of bent wire all obediently twitched when they could see water, and didn't when they couldn't. But then came the real test, with lids on the buckets. Because it was a double-blind trial, neither the dowser nor Dr. French, who was keeping score, knew which buckets contained water. The accomplice who set them up did so with the tent sealed, and he then disappeared so that he couldn't give the game away by any subtle cues. Under these double-blind conditions, not a single one of the dowsers scored above chance level. They were flabbergasted, desperately, in one case tearfully disappointed, and obviously sincere. Such failure had never happened to them before, but they had never done a double-blind trial before. I don't know who invented the double-blind trial, but it is a brilliantly effective yet simple technique. There's a telling story in John Diamond's courageous book, Snake Oil, written when he was dying of cancer and beset by well-meaning quacks. The skeptical investigator Ray Hyman once did a double-blind trial of an alternative diagnostic technique called kinesiology. As it happens, I've experienced kinesiology myself. I'd ricked my neck and was in pain. It was the weekend and I couldn't go to my normal doctor, so I decided to be open-minded and try an alternative practitioner. Before beginning her manipulation, she did a diagnostic test which consisted of pushing against my arm to test my strength while I was lying on my back, kinesiology. She demonstrated to her own satisfaction that my arm was stronger when I had a small vial of vitamin C resting on my chest. The vial was sealed, there was no way for the vitamin to enter my body. So it was obvious that she was really, though probably subconsciously, pressing harder against my arm when the vial was not there than when it was. When I expressed my skepticism, she gushed her enthusiasm. Yes, C is a marvelous vitamin, isn't it? Self-deception of that kind is precisely what the double-blind technique was invented to eliminate. In testing the efficacy of any medicine, not only must it be compared with the placebo control, it is vitally important that neither the patient, nor the experimenter, nor the nurse administering the doses should know which is experimental, which control. Ray Hyman did a double-blind trial of a slightly less far-fetched claim of kinesiology than used by my quack, that a drop of fructose placed on the tongue would strengthen a patient's arm when compared with a drop of glucose. Under double-blind conditions, there was no difference in strength. Whereat the chief kinesiologist delivered himself of this immortally indignant remark. You see, that's why we never do double-blind testing anymore. It never works.
Well, I think that's one brilliant way of demonstrating science and the techniques of science on television. You've also written in the book about how you discuss science more generally and more broadly, and something we were talking about earlier, which is the desire amongst some television producers to always stage debates.
Oh, yes.
And I do remember Horizon going through a period where everything had to be a debate, and they seemed to be interviewing people who appeared to have polar opposite views, but you kind of knew if you got them into the same room, you'd end up with some kind of common ground and actually something a lot more fruitful than what they actually ended up with. But they seemed to think that it was more attractive to have a debate. So you write about a particular debate that you and Steven Pinker had that got picked up by television.
This wasn't really a debate. I mean, we had a discussion. Steven Pinker, you know, the linguist and psychologist, and we had an encounter at I think it's called the Methodist Hall in Westminster. It's a very big theatre. It holds 2,000 people, and we filled it. There were 2,000 people there, and it went very well. And it was my first example of what I've nowadays taken to calling the mutual tutorial. Mutual tutorial is something I'm trying to pioneer. It's not a debate and it's not an interview. It's a case where two people are on a stage who each have something to teach the other. They each have something to learn from the other. And the audience learns from watching these two people interact with each other and learning from each other. So they're not having a quarrel, not having a debate. One isn't interviewing the other. They're learning from each other in this mutual tutorial. I think it was this meeting with Steven Pinker that gave me the idea. Anyway, it was a success, and the BBC got to hear of it. And they've asked us whether we would consent to go into a studio that evening and reprise the event and have a briefer discussion on television. And that evening, the BBC producer telephoned me before the show, and she said, "Tell me, what's the nature of your disagreement with Dr. Pinker?" So I said, "Well, actually, I'm not sure we have much to offer in the way of a disagreement. We seem to agree over most things. Is that a problem?" There was a long pause from the other end of the line. "No disagreement? No disagreement? Oh dear." And she promptly cancelled the invitation. Mutually informative conversation, it seems, is not good television. There has to be disagreement. Sparks must fly. If good television means good for ratings, that's depressing. I'd like to hope that she was mistaken and that disagreement is not, in truth, good for ratings, but I can't summon up much conviction. In any case, my own value judgment, as I said in the previous chapter, would place ratings rather low in the scale of what good television ought to mean, especially for the BBC, which doesn't have to worry about advertising revenue since it's financed by central government through the licence fee. Since that time, I've done a number of mutual tutorials with a number of people, perhaps most notably with the physicist Lawrence Krauss, where we'd encountered each other on several occasions, and many of these have been gathered together in a film, a full-length feature documentary called The Unbelievers, where we were filmed in Sydney Opera House and various other places. Learning from each other, with the audience, I hope, learning from both of us and from the fact that we were learning from each other. So that's The Unbelievers, and actually there's a more recent encounter between Lawrence and me, just been put up on YouTube. I can't remember what it's called, but it was filmed in the Czech Republic, and I think that's the best one we've ever done, actually.
Do you think it's a model that could work in universities as well?
Yes, I do. I hadn't thought of that, actually, Alice, but yes, I do think so. I think it would be, I mean, after all, a lecture shouldn't really be to impart information. I mean, the students can read. Well, most of them, anyway. So you don't want a lecturer to just tell them something. It's much more educational if you can watch a lecturer sort of reaching for an idea, and that could be enhanced if it was a mutual I'd love to have one with you, by the way, on one of these days.
Well, I was just thinking of an example that happened to me relatively recently, actually, in Birmingham, where I was lecturing to first-year undergraduates on anatomy, and they were physiotherapy students and sports exercise science students. But in the audience, there were 10 members of staff as well, who had very interesting areas of research that I'd kind of struck up a conversation with them before we went into the lecture theatre. And I covered the content, such as it was, in about 40 minutes. And then we had about 10, 15 minutes of really interesting discussion with both the students and these particular members of staff. And there was some fantastic
I bet they remember that.
concepts
I bet they
emerging
remember
out of
that. Yes.
Yeah. I think it would work really well.
Yes.
Moving on to another wonderful story and looking for the humanity in science, I think, which does come out in your books. And I think that obviously that was the whole subject of Unweaving the Rainbow, that understanding the world around us doesn't lessen the wonder, and if anything, it increases the wonder. And certainly that's been my experience of science. But then there are some areas of science which I think seem very cold and unforgiving and austere and difficult to approach, and you need the right people to help you make those connections and to make them human again. And there's this absolutely wonderful story about Carolyn Porco.
Oh, yes. Carolyn Porco came to visit us in Oxford and has been friends with Lalla and me ever since. She is a planetary scientist in charge of NASA's Cassini imaging team, the team that has brought us those stunning pictures sent back from Saturn and its many moons. But she's more than just a good scientist. She's inspired by the poetry of science, especially the romance of the spheres that share our sun. She's the nearest approach I know to a female Carl Sagan, a poet of the planets and singer of the stars. Whether or not the heroine of the book Contact was actually modelled on her, it is a fact that Carl Sagan invited her to be the character consultant on the film version. The scene where Ellie first hears the unmistakable communication from far space still gives me goosebumps when I think of it. The slender, clever young woman, woken up by the mind-shattering signal, bouncing back to base in her open car, exultantly yelling the celestial coordinates into the intercom for her dozing assistants. Numbers, numbers, the spine-tingling poetry of those numbers and their arc-second precision. And how poetically right that the hero of the numbers should have been a woman, a role model just like Carolyn. An anecdote displays the poetry of Carolyn, and I related it in the Oxford Playhouse when introducing her Simone lecture. That was a series of lectures that I organised in honour of the benefactor of my professorship, Charles Simone. A beloved professor from her days at Caltech was the geologist Eugene Shoemaker, co-discoverer with his wife and David Levy of the famous Shoemaker-Levy comet. A pioneer of astrogeology, Shoemaker was part of the Apollo space program. He was in the running to be the first geologist on the moon, but to his sad regret, had to drop out for health reasons, and he turned to training astronauts instead of being one. In 1997, Shoemaker was killed in a car crash in Australia. Carolyn, in her grief, raced into action. She knew that NASA was about to launch an unmanned craft, which was programmed to crash land on the moon after its mission was accomplished. She managed to persuade the mission manager, as well as the head of the planetary exploration program at NASA, to add her teacher's ashes to the spacecraft's payload. Gene Shoemaker's ambition to be an astronaut was denied him in life, but his ashes now lie on the moon's surface, where no wind stirs them. It is said that Neil Armstrong's footprints are almost certainly still intact. And she added a photographic engraving bearing these words chosen from Romeo and Juliet. "And when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun." I've dined out on that story from time to time, but I usually cannot manage to recite the Shakespeare and turn to Lalla to rescue me. When she speaks the lines from memory in her beautiful voice, I think I'm not the only one around the table to choke up.
Well done. You managed it without Lella. Absolutely beautiful, and I think really does speak to the humanity in science and in scientists. Of course, we are normal people, and on this theme of perhaps interplanetary science and imagining the Cassini probe travelling out and circling Saturn and giving us those wonderful pictures of the Earth and the Moon as tiny specks in the sky. When we look out and we see the vastness of space and imagine that there might be life somewhere out there, even if it's not intelligent life, some kind of life out there, you have argued that you think that Darwinian principles will still play.
Science fiction authors, of course, let their imagination run free and come up with all sorts of weird and wonderful alien creatures. But I'm intrigued to wonder whether there's anything that we already know from first principles is likely to be true or inevitably has to be true. Are there some things about life on this planet which just happen to be true on this planet? Or are there some things which just had to be true because there's only one way for life to be? For example, does there have to be, say, a digital genetics like DNA? Not necessarily DNA, but having the same quality of DNA of being digital and highly accurate. And among the qualities that I would bet my shirt on is that if there is life elsewhere, I'm pretty sure there is, if there is life elsewhere, it will be Darwinian life.
Not Lamarckian.
Well, the Lamarckian theory is the only other one that's ever been suggested which might conceivably be realistic. And as you know, the thing that's wrong with Lamarckian evolution is that it postulates the inheritance of acquired characteristics. The classic example of something like the blacksmith's arms, which because he uses the muscles so much, the muscles become bigger, and which of course they do. And so his children start off, inherit the bigger arms that he developed. Well, that, of course, doesn't happen in our kind of life. But it's been suggested that there's no reason why that shouldn't happen in some other form of life. And if it did happen, wouldn't Lamarckian evolution be just as plausible? Couldn't there be a form of life that evolved by Lamarckian means rather than Darwinian means? The other half of the Lamarckian theory is the principle of use and disuse, the principle that when you use a bit of your body, it does in fact grow bigger, which is true of muscles and maybe a couple of other things. But one of my objections to I don't think. But what I wanted to do, I gave a paper on what I called universal Darwinism at the Darwin Centenary Conference in Cambridge in 1982. And I wanted to make the point that even if acquired characteristics were inherited, Lamarckian evolution could not work, partly because the principle of use and disuse is so crude. It works for muscles and perhaps bones, but it can't possibly work for the finely chiseled details of evolution. The eye that is so acute, that sees things with such beautiful detail, focusing, iris diaphragm contracting, that can't be done by the principle of use and disuse. Natural selection, on the other hand, can cope with every single little detail. Anything that's an improvement, no matter how deeply buried, natural selection can seize hold of it and favour it. So at this Cambridge conference, I argued against the idea that the only thing wrong with the Lamarckian theory is an ugly fact. Acquired characteristics are not inherited. It's remarkable how popular the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics is, by the way. Successive generations of biologists even desperately struggle to try to find evidence for it. It seems to be something that people emotionally want to be true. And I have an anecdote in the book about a dog that a beloved dog my mother had called Bunch.
You weren't going to mention Bunch, Richard. We agreed you weren't going
Oh,
to talk
okay.
about
I won't
Bunch.
then. Okay.
You can. You can.
All right, you've given me permission now.
Yes.
I'll have to read the poem, though, in that case.
Yes. You have to read the
Okay.
poem.
Bunch you hobbled on 3 legs, and it happened that a neighbour had a dog who'd lost a leg in an accident. And the neighbour was convinced that this dog must be Bunch's father because he would inherit. And now I think Alice is going to allow me to read.
Look, I've crossed it out. I've crossed it out. You can read the poem about Bunch if you then read the rather negative little paragraph.
Okay, I will do that. Okay.
And there's an extra bit.
Indulge me in a shameless moment of sentiment. Looking this week through a tattered folder of poems that my parents collected for each other over many years, painstakingly copied out by hand, I found the following in my mother's handwriting, obviously written immediately after the death of Bunch. It is unfinished, as can be seen from the crossings out and corrections, but I think it's beautiful enough to be reproduced here. And if you can't be sentimental in an autobiography, when can you? Dear little ghost of happiness, who lopes beside me down the years, no dog of flesh and blood will take your place, nor ever stem the tears that come unbidden from the heart. For you were very part of me, and all the fields and all the ways down woodland ride or open hill are empty places now for me. You are not there. You are not there. Dear Bunch, it's all nonsense to say you can't miss a dog as much as a person. Or to put it another way, for purposes of mourning, a dog can become a person. I didn't argue for universal Darwinism very well at the Cambridge conference, badly underestimating the time it would take to develop the theme. And in those days I was less skilled at concealing my discomfort when I made a mistake of that kind. This wasn't the only occasion on which I ran out of time, and I recall the familiar sensation of red overheating and literally sweating with anxiety and panic. During the coffee break, after what I perceived as my failure, I sat on disconsolately motionless in the emptying lecture hall. A sweet friend who saw my distress came up behind me and silently kissed the top of my head with her hands gently resting on my shoulders. The warmth of feminine tendresse is one of the good reasons for staying alive. When I came to reprise the story of universal Darwinism in the last chapter of The Blind Watchmaker, I told it better.
I think that's a really interesting and thoughtful passage because it's obviously a very negative experience. Yeah. But did you find it useful? Did you find that your ideas, having been tested, not to destruction, but you obviously hadn't got to the point where you could complete your argument.
No, that's
did that
right.
help you?
Well, it did. Yes, I mean, I learned it's one of several experiences which taught me better how to handle time and how to adjust a lecture on the fly.
But did it actually change your ideas as well? I mean, did it?
No, I think the ideas were pretty much the same, and I repeated them in the Blind Watchmaker. It was fairly vigorously attacked at the time after my talk. Stephen Gould actually was the main attacker, whom we've already met, and he pointed. I mean, he had vast historical knowledge of the history of biology, and he was able to say quite correctly that, quite apart from Lamarckism, there had been several other evolution theories, mutationism, for example, around the turn of the 19th, 20th century. And so he was making the historical point that there were other such theories, but he missed the point that those ones, for example, mutationism, the mutationists believed that you didn't need selection. Mutation alone would do the job. Well, that's obvious nonsense, because mutation on its own couldn't possibly produce adaptation, couldn't possibly produce functional appropriateness. It couldn't make an eye that could see or a wing that could fly. It would just produce monstrosities. So he was making a good historical point, but a terrible biological point.
So I'm fairly persuaded by universal Darwinism. I think if there is any life out there, then it's Darwinian. I'm still not holding out hope for anything that intelligent, though.
No, I agree. Yep.
Jim Al-Khalili tweeted something a while ago about the potential of finding life out there, and I said, "Go away, Jim. I'm not interested unless it's got arms and legs and a brain."
Well, actually, I mean, the sort of argument one would deploy in favour of it would be the sheer number of stars and therefore planets that there are, something like 10 to the 22 at last count. But by the same token, that statistical argument, that gigantic number, I mean, compare it to, suppose that there are only 1 billion examples of intelligent life. And I use the word only advisedly because in 10 to the 22, 1 billion is a tiny number. And so there could be 1 billion examples of intelligent life out there, but so spaced out that we'll never know about them and they'll never know about each other.
And also, there's no need for them to coincide in time anyway.
No, indeed, they could be, yes, exactly. Yeah.
So there could have been intelligent life that's gone.
Yep. Maybe intelligent life goes extinct very rapidly because it's intelligent and blows itself up. That's a rather depressing thought that's been mooted.
So we do need to talk about religion.
Yes,
obviously. Okay. Obviously, your major onslaught, if I can call it that, was in the God delusion, and here you are in this book defending the right to poke fun. And I think it is defensible because you poke fun at yourself, you poke fun at science. You know, your jokes are throughout and they're aimed at absolutely everybody. But here is an excerpt which is about the inability to poke fun at religion, which I rather like.
Here's an example of the kind of thing in the God delusion to which I suspect critics take exception as savage or strident, aggressive or offensive, but which I see as good-natured satire, a touch of the stiletto perhaps, but miles away from the bludgeon or from vulgar abuse. After pointing out that Roman Catholicism, though avowedly monotheistic, has leanings towards polytheism, with the Virgin Mary a goddess in all but name, and the saints attracting personal supplications as demigods, each in his own specialist field of expertise, I continued, Pope John Paul II created more saints than all his predecessors of the past several centuries put together, and he had a special affinity with the Virgin Mary. His polytheistic hankerings were dramatically demonstrated in 1981 when he suffered an assassination attempt in Rome and attributed his survival to intervention by Our Lady of Fatima. A maternal hand guided the bullet. One cannot help wondering why she didn't guide it to miss him altogether. Others might think the team of surgeons who operated on him for 6 hours deserved at least a share of the credit, but perhaps their hands too were maternally guided. The relevant point is that it wasn't just Our Lady who, in the Pope's opinion, guided the bullet, but specifically Our Lady of Fatima. Presumably Our Lady of Lourdes, Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Medjugorje, Our Lady of Akita, Our Lady of Zaitun, Our Lady of Garabandal, and Our Lady of Knock were busy on other errands at the time. Wounding sarcasm, perhaps, but strident? I don't think so, and certainly not symptomatic of Tourette's syndrome, as one critic has accused me of. I think it's legitimate satire and would like to think quite funny, but it gave grave offence not only to Catholics, but even to the rightly admired Melvyn Bragg, a non-religious cultural commentator and enabler who is well on his way to national treasurehood. Such censure arises only, I suspect, because we've taken on board a convention that religion is off-limits to criticism.
Yes, I think it's right. And you also, at another point in the book, talk about theology and talk about the unassailable facts within theology, so the sort of assumptions that it's based on.
I've been a bit negative about theology, but I do think that professors of theology who do things like analysing in a scholarly way biblical texts or looking at biblical history, comparative religion, that kind of thing, that's a very worthwhile exercise and should be done. What I don't think is a legitimate academic exercise is things like puzzling over the theology of the transubstantiation and the Trinity and things like that, which all are based upon an assumption which we have no reason to make. And so I've been a bit sarcastic about theology for that reason.
So there are aspects of it which include, I suppose, literary and historical study.
Yes,
that you think
which I think
are well-founded.
Yes, and properly belong in a university. But arguing about whether the wafer really does turn into the body of Christ or only symbolically, that's not a proper academic subject, I don't think.
So these kinds of theological gymnastics then you discuss in the book, and you also imagine what would happen if we used a similar approach to science.
Science, yes. Theological gymnastics over the significance for us today of nonsensical ideas from the past, like transubstantiation, lend themselves to satire, positively beg for it. A gem that I recently met. Of course we don't literally believe the story of Jonah and the whale, but it is symbolic of Jesus' death and resurrection. Suppose science worked like that. Suppose that, to take a most unlikely hypothetical, future scientists were to find that Watson and Crick were completely wrong and the genetic molecule is not a double helix at all. Ah, well, of course, nowadays we no longer literally believe in the double helix. But what is the significance of the double helix for us today? The way the two helices twine intimately around one another, though not literally true in the crude materialistic sense, nevertheless symbolizes mutual love, don't you feel? The precise one-to-one pairing of purines with pyrimidine is not literally true, nothing so crude as that, but it stands for... When you contemplate the Watson-Crick model, don't you get an overwhelming feeling? I know I do.
The trouble is, it's so easy to satirise. And yet it is so prevalent in our society. We talked a little bit about faith schools, as we were about to come in.
I do think that religious education belongs in schools, provided it's education about religion, not education in a particular religion, telling the child that she belongs to this religion and therefore believes so and so. But it is important that children should learn about religion because religion is so important in history and the different denominations are so important in European history. Different religions are so important in history. And literature too. I mean, you can't take your allusions to English poetry, English literature, unless you know the Bible.
But your Jonah and the whale story reminded me of, my daughter goes to a C.O.V. school, and
yes.
She went to a service 2 weeks ago, last week in fact, where the theme of the service was saints and superheroes. And the whole point of this, it turned out, was that superheroes aren't real. Probably leave it there. I think you do, in the book, at many points, bring out the sort of life-affirming nature of a scientific worldview, and that sometimes your critics see you as being extremely negative and antagonistic about religion, and actually counter to that is this very positive view of a scientific approach to the world and the value and the meaning that we can find through that sort of approach, that you see it as a life-affirming one rather than a life-impoverishing one, and a source of wonder rather than an enemy of that. So I think we'll probably finish with this passage, Richard.
By the way, we share that, of course. I mean, you and I share that sense of science as poetry, and the idea that it is an absolutely amazing privilege to be able to be born into this world and then grow up and be educated to understand where we came from, what we are, what we're made of, what makes us work, where the world comes from. This is such a beautiful thing to experience, and we are so privileged living in the 21st century. We're so privileged to live after Darwin, to live after Einstein, to live after Newton, and to be part of a civilization that has escaped from the sort of early benighted ignorance. Okay, this final paragraph, which is, yes, as you describe, if there are passages of the God delusion which can be read by the sensitive as strongly critical, if not actually strident, the book both ends and begins gently. The last section, entitled The Mother of All Burkas, is an extended metaphor. The life-impoverishing slit in the burqa stands for the narrowness of a pre-scientific worldview, and I go on to illustrate various ways in which the slit can be widened, with consequent enhancement of life and its joys. Science widens it, for example, by showing what a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum is visible to our senses. The beginning of the book is a generous reminiscence about a chaplain at my old school who, as a boy, was lying with his face in the grass and was inspired by a moment of revelation to embrace the religion which was to become his life's path. Suddenly, the microforest of the turf seemed to swell and become one with the universe and with the rapt mind of the boy contemplating it. I respected his epiphany enough to say that, in another time and place, that boy could have been me under the stars, dazzled by Orion, Cassiopeia, and Ursa Major, tearful with the unheard music of the Milky Way, heady with the night scents of frangipani and trumpet flowers in an African garden. The reference to Ursa Major was consciously prompted by the memory of a poem written by my mother as a girl, which concluded with the following lines. The great bear stands upon his head, his paws among the apple boughs, that, dark against a darker sky, wave in the wind and tap their twigs with little sounds forlorn and sad within the night's dark emptiness. My opening page ended with a warmly indulgent reminiscence of how we used to distract our chaplain in divinity lessons by asking him to recall his wartime service in the RAF. And I quoted, in his honour, John Betjeman's gently affectionate poem, Our Padre. Our Padre is an old sky pilot. Severely now they've clipped his wings, but still the flagstaff in the rectory garden points to higher things. After my book was published, I was delighted when an old boy at the same school sent a little poem into my website, richarddawkins.net. I knew your flying chaplain. As my housemaster I oughter. While you embraced his liberal views, I just embraced his daughter. Whatever the faults of a British private school education, Oundle must have something going for it if it produces alumni who can turn out that sort of thing.
Well, Richard, I think you've taken us full circle. We've heard about the African garden again, and we've come back to that idea of inspiration. Your book begins in New College, Oxford, and ends in New College, Oxford, with your 70th birthday celebrations there. And we're closing another circle here tonight because we're also remembering your Christmas lectures back in 1991. Mm-hmm. And so it falls to me to thank you very much for the readings this evening and bearing with the readings that I've chosen for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Which must, in some sense, have been true over the past 3 million years, because otherwise our brains wouldn't have got bigger.
They've got slightly smaller since the Paleolithic, though.
Have they?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, another mutual.
We're on a downward trend now,
yes.
everybody.
Yeah. Yes, well, I believe it.